In this short coaching video, I'll be discussing the process of collecting and analyzing baseline data, something I like to refer to as establishing a line in the sand to measure improvement from. At the heart of this process, and to establish your line in the sand, lies a single question. How well is the process currently performing? Let's take a look at how we go about answering this question. The first thing we need to determine is what to measure. There are a few questions we can use to answer this question. First, what's the problem we're trying to solve? We need to first understand the problem in order to understand how best to measure it. A second question we can ask is, how will I know, using data, when the problem has been reduced and/or eliminated? A third question might be, what could I measure to determine the size of the problem? A final question to ask is, what data exists that could be used to measure the size of the problem? In an ideal scenario, we won't need to collect any data if the data already exists, but in most cases this won't be true. But if it is, you'll be able to move quickly through the process and jump straight to analyzing your data. Once you've determined what you'll measure, make sure to document it on your project charter or contract as a way of validating team consensus before moving forward. Now that we've agreed to what we're going to measure, the next step becomes putting a plan together to capture the data. Most important to this process is starting with the end in mind. We need to determine where we want to end up in order to build a plan to get there. This starts by identifying what we're going to measure. And what I mean by what is exactly what it is we're measuring. For example, if we've decided to measure cycle time, that seems simple enough, but what specifically are we going to measure? What will be our starting point? What will be our ending point? Without defining these, your definition of cycle time may not be the same as mine. Get specific about what it is you're going to measure, because this will become critical to consistently measuring the cycle time again after we've implemented improvements. Think of it this way. We want to be able to have an apples-to-apples comparison, and we can't achieve this without clearly defining what we're measuring. Who is going to do the measuring? We need to identify by name who will collect the data. How frequently are we going to capture data? Hourly, daily, weekly? Ideally, we want to capture data frequently enough to include all potential forms of variation in the process, such as people working different shifts, using different materials, equipment, etc. How will we capture the data? This could include the equipment to measure and/or technology used to measure. Just make sure how people will capture the data is well defined. Think of this as an SOP for how to do the measuring. What we're striving for here is keeping the variation in the data we're collecting from the process to just the process variables, and not variables related to how the measurements are being taken. One of the most frequent questions I get is, how much data should I collect? There are some statistical rules that will dictate how valid your analysis will be. For example, you couldn't expect to have valid conclusions based on 4 data points. Ideally, more data is better than less data, but as a general rule of thumb, I would suggest collecting at least 10 to 15 data points. A final consideration for your data collection plan is how you'll document your data. Most of the time, this will be some type of Excel spreadsheet. Remember what I said about starting with the end in mind? Set up your spreadsheet to get you where you want to end up. Some simple tips include putting your data in columns, not rows, and if you're collecting time-based data, set up one column for the data, for the date and/or the time, and a second column for what you're measuring. The best advice I can give you here is to keep it simple. Don't have 10 columns of data when all you need is 2. Now it's time to execute your plan and actually collect your data. A couple things to keep in mind while working your plan are, first, to expect some resistance. In most cases, what you're going to be asking people to do is above and beyond what they're currently doing, and who's looking for more work to do. There are, however, some things you can do to minimize the resistance. The most impactful thing you can do to minimize resistance is to establish a why. And what I mean by this is to show those who are collecting the data why the results will be important to making their work lives better. Essentially, you want to tap into their heart and why this data matters to them. There's no question you need to trust those collecting data for you. but you also need to verify the data is being captured. Don't wait until the end of the data collection cycle to collect your data. I suggest on a daily basis, at least to start, you follow up on those people who are collecting the data to make sure they're doing it correctly. This is also a great opportunity to show appreciation to those who are collecting the data. The worst thing that could take place is telling people to collect data and then disappearing for a long time. This is a clear message you don't care about the data. And there's nothing worse than having to collect data for someone who never comes back to get it or follows up. People will perceive the process as a total waste of their time, and they'll be right. A final thing to consider as you collect your data is to routinely pick up the data that's been collected. This will give you a jump start on your analysis and also be a preventive measure to avoid losing data that's collected if you simply pick up all the data points at one time. Now, with your data collected, we next turn to analyzing the data. Be careful because this is when overcomplication tends to set in by doing 46 different analyses when typically just one or two are needed. Remember to keep it simple and focus on the one number that matters most to establishing your line in the sand. Typically, there are two numbers we'll want to establish our line, one or two numbers that we'll want to establish our line. Either we're focused on some type of average or percentage. Averages are most common when we're striving to move a metric higher or lower, such as cycle time or some other type of process measure. And percentage is most common when we're striving to reduce defects or increase the percent of time we do a process correctly. Start with these two options and pick one that best fits your problem. The final step in this process, and arguably the most important, is summarizing your results. If you can't communicate your results clearly, all the analysis and data collection in the world won't matter. I suggest striving to do this in a visual format. Not many people like to look at a table full of numbers or a bunch of bullet points on a PowerPoint slide. Find one or two visual tools to help tell your story of your process's current state. Also, keep in mind this is just the beginning of your story. After you implement improvements, you'll be telling the second half of the story. So be sure to set up your visual tool to be able to tell your before versus after story. This can be the most impactful aspect of your improvement project, and in many cases, this single visual illustration will serve as a way to tell your entire project story. I suggest that if you're working with averages to measure your problem, a trend line and/or a control chart tend to work best. If your problem is based on percentages, pie charts work well. So now let's summarize what we've just discussed. Establishing your line in the sand doesn't have to be a monumental task if you first clearly understand how best to measure your problem. Next, create a plan to capture the data and execute the plan effectively. Then keep the analysis simple. And finally, summarize the results in a visually appealing way that tells the first half of your project story.